have to unmute myself. So welcome. Hopefully this is the right start for everybody. My name is Kathleen Rooney. I'm going to be the moderator today. And I'm with Ulupono Initiative, a Hawaii-based impact investment firm that focuses on making Hawaii more sustainable and self-sufficient and resilient. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about a livable city. And I'm going to start out with sort of talking about what that means, because not everybody might be familiar with it. And it is somewhat of a broad term. And then we were going to let everybody speak for a bit, and then we're going to dive into conversation. So as a heads up, bring your questions. I'll be monitoring the Q&A and trying to bring everything together. So we'll start with that. And then, are you guys seeing the right version? You've seen the main slide, right? Not the notes? Okay, great. So let's just dive right in. For those of you who haven't necessarily, been living and breathing the term livable or livability, although you probably have been, you just didn't notice it. There's a lot of different ways of looking at it, but when we talk about it, generally it's a few components. And this is really just to help get people in the frame of mind of what you can ask about and what we're going to be talking about, but it is not meant to be a limiting factor. It's usually talking about affordable and accessible housing, safe and convenient transportation options, health access, quality and equity, neighborhood and access and convenience to services, schools, needs, all those kinds of things, clean air and water, really robust civic and social engagement, and opportunity and inclusion. So it includes sort of, what our cities look like and how we, design them, how we live in them, sort of in a physical sense, but it also includes these other sort of social infrastructure things that make that experience incredibly rich and rewarding at the end of the day. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that apparently there are two different ways of spelling livable. The one that we have right here is actually the British way of doing it, whereas I think a few of us are more used to the American version in which the E is removed. So apologies if we go back and forth, but I think that sort of shows how this term is, can take on different meanings in different contexts and different spellings in different continents. So one of the things that I think is sort of helpful sometimes to talk about is to kind of show what a 15-minute city is. So this is actually here in Honolulu. And I think what's really great about it is that we have a lot of these here where you can reach a lot of, at least the basic necessities and the things that you probably need to reach in a given day all in one space. Now, that doesn't mean that those are necessarily the restaurants or the doctors you want to visit. We all like a lot of choice. But I do think it's kind of important to show is that there are a lot of communities and places across America where this isn't even the building block they're starting from. And we have a lot of these and we have a lot of options. And I think that that's one of the things that we really want to focus on today, which is what are the things that we have great here that already make our communities super livable? And, what are the great things that we're doing to make it, that we have more transportation options, that we have more housing options, that we're building more community and those types of things. Some of those things are, we have a lot of really great, significant policy commitments. And I think it's important to recognize those, in other places, they're not even at those points where people acknowledge or that they want these things and have made sort of broader commitments. We are doing a ton on all of these topics. Today, we have folks from different areas to kind of talk about some of those things in more depth and highlight some of those places. And so I'm just really excited to, really talk about the ways we are a model for the future in a lot of communities and where we're headed and how we're going to continue that progress. So as I said, I'm Kathleen Rooney. I'm the Director of Transportation Policy and Programs at Ulupono Initiative. And today I have Renee Espiau with me. She is the Complete Streets Administrator for the city and county. I have CJ, also Christopher Johnson, who's the Built Environment and Active Transportation Specialist at the Hawaii State Department of Health. And then Harrison Rue, who's the Community Building and Transit-Oriented Development Administrator at the City and County of Honolulu. That is a mouthful, Harrison. I don't think I've ever had to say it, but that is a lot of nouns. But yeah, so we are all going to kind of talk, I'm not going to, everybody else is going to talk a little bit about the work that they're doing, and then we are going to dive into conversation about it. Now I can't remember who's going first. I wrote it down and then completely forgot. I think CJ, you were up first, correct?
Sure.
So, all right, let's do that. So CJ, take it away.
Right. If you could stop sharing, there we go. I'll share mine here real quick. All right, give me a second to get this lined up good. So thank you. Yeah, my name is CJ Johnson. I work in the Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Promotion Division of the Department of Health, the Hawaii State Department of Health. So technically, I'm the physical activity coordinator. I think some folks here, physical activity coordinator, assume that I'm like a physiologist or a sports medicine expert. But my background and my expertise is in active transportation advocacy and in health communication. Department of Health recently published our Healthy Hawaii Strategic Plan 2030 update, and our physical activity goals and objectives are all based in built environment and policy, or as we refer to them in the plan, community design and access. You can check it out at Hawaii at hhsp.gov, I believe, or just Google Healthy Hawaii Strategic Plan. We're really proud of the document. Actually, I think everybody on this call was involved in its creation, which we're really proud that we had a really great multi-sector collaboration in developing our goals. I think historically, we have had a lot of focus on encouragement, but what we understand now is that where you live, the design, the environmental and social factors and transportation systems that you depend on to connect you with healthy food, healthcare, education, jobs, worship, recreation, civic participation has this really huge impact on your health outcomes. So over the past several years, the CDC at the national level and the Department of Health at the state level, our strategy for promoting physical activity has shifted, I think, primarily from that encouragement piece to a really, really heavy focus on the built environment and what we call the social determinants of health. And social determinants are those factors outside of your genetics that have this really profound impact on your health outcome, things like education access, healthcare access, your neighborhood and your built environment, which we're talking about, social and community context and economic stability. And all of these can either create access to health and opportunity and vibrancy, or they can reinforce barriers. And that's what we see a lot. And over the course of 2020, of course, we have had this additional challenge in our social determinants of health, which is the COVID pandemic. And even though nominally I work in the chronic disease branch, of course, as you might expect, everybody that works in the Department of Health had to kind of pull double duty and work on COVID as well. And so one of the really cruel things about the COVID outbreak was that it further exploited all of these social determinants, right? A lot of these same factors that reinforce our susceptibility or vulnerability to chronic diseases like heart disease and diabetes also made people much more likely, in this compound way that was especially cruel, made people more likely to be exposed to COVID-19, or less likely to have access to therapies or healthcare that could help them keep from getting sick. But then also because of these pre-existing things like increased incidence of heart disease and diabetes and these other comorbidities, once you get sick, you're actually likely to get more sick if you're in these disadvantaged, socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. So it was a really, really hard hitting, and it was a really big challenge that diverted a lot of our attention that would normally be focused on active living and active transportation. And in the course of that, we were really fortunate to be able to do this outreach called COFI. And that was our COVID Outreach and Public Health Education Initiative, where essentially for most of 2020 and a good chunk of this year, we were focusing on outreach to these populations, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and Filipino populations that had been disparately impacted. And it was really important that there was a sense that, our traditional English language, mass media focused outreach and education programs were not reaching and were not impacting, and were maybe less culturally relevant or maybe less heard. And there was a lot of folks that were left behind by these communication strategies. So the strategy behind COFI was, rather than trying to broadcast on all channels, what if we relied on and developed formal partnerships with existing organizations? And so what we identified really quickly last year was that there were a lot of really great organizations in the community that were, whether they were public health organizations or not, had just stood up to do all this work in their community, whether that was running food drives or managing PPE distribution or doing their own social media education or doing rental assistance webinars. And they had, over the course of the pandemic, and in some cases for years before the pandemic, really authentic, earned, credible connections with the communities that we're concerned about. So rather than trying to do our own things, we were, the thing was like, well, why don't we fund these partners to become our partners in COVID response and outreach? And so we were working with them to amplify our reach to, consulates, faith leaders, businesses, and these social media channels. And it actually ended up being a really successful COVID strategy. And then I think as we started to think in the early half of this year, as we were getting really vaccinated and things seemed to be getting back to normal, we were in a position where we were able to reach out to these partners and say, the problems, these social determinants, these inequities that led to these disparities in COVID, things like language and geographic barriers and barriers to access to care and mobility, didn't go away. They weren't created by COVID and certainly aren't going to go away because of COVID. And it was really important that these same partners that we had developed these relationships with became our built environment partners. And so that led to the creation of a number of transportation equity initiatives that we're really excited about, that are a little bit unfortunately delayed because of the July and August, September surge that we dealt with. But I think now that we are maybe a little bit more optimistic that we're moving in the right direction with vaccination and our case rate is manageable, we're really looking at how we can take these partnerships and this networking that we've developed and focus it on active living and active transportation. And I was really pleased to find out that when we started to turn to these partners, community partners like We Are Oceania and Papa'olakahi and the Marshallese Community Organization of Hawaii, and brought this to their, brought this up with them. Do you guys want to be involved with this stuff? People were really excited. And so we've got a number of initiatives that we're really psyched about in terms of transportation equity. We have a CDC grant called BRIC, or Building Resilient Inclusive Communities, that's allowed us to actually stand up a community working group of folks that represent or are in service organizations or social services and focus on communities that have been disparately impacted, to allow them to convene and give them sort of the support and wrap around to become experts on transportation policy, so they can become a voice and have a more active voice in transportation decision making, which is one of the complaints we hear a lot from communities that have been disadvantaged, is that a lot of decisions get made without their buy-in. We're working really closely with PATH, which is the People for Active Transportation Hawaii on the Big Island, who've been doing some capacity building around being more intentional and deliberate about centering equity in their work as well. And we're really excited about that. And hopefully folks are aware of K-Vibe, which is a youth bike co-op in Kalihi here in Honolulu. And we've been trying to help them develop some of the capacity. That they have had some leadership changes lately, and they're really excited to develop some capacity. So we've been working with them on connecting them with league certified safety instructor training for bicycling. We're getting them some tools and really trying to foster some youth advocacy and youth leadership and connect them into the transportation equity work that we're doing, knowing that safe routes is this really important part of our vision for a safer future and getting kids biking and walking to school more. And K-Vibe have been a really important part of that. We have a health equity grant through CDC that's funding a Safe Routes for Every Kid coordinator that's going to hopefully, as we get it online here, allow us to offer some technical assistance and capacity to priority population schools in areas that maybe need some additional support in organizing and asking for and trying to identify funding and trying to get attention and coordination around addressing their environmental disparities and promoting some programmatic responses, like things that'll get kids to ride and feel more safe riding to school. And then a big part of this is connecting community health workers. One thing that we've learned, I think, really resolutely through the pandemic is it's a lot easier. It would be a lot easier for me, for example, to grab someone off the street who speaks Chukis or Marshallese or some of our priority languages and teach them the basics of public health, of how vaccines work or how COVID hygiene should work, than it would be to grab a public health educator and try to teach them cultural competency or how to teach or how to speak Chukis. And so what that tells us, I think, is that we've been really systemically undervaluing lived experience and language skills in public health and in our outreach. And so we have been making a really concerted effort to change that and to honor just how valuable and invaluable, in fact, that lived experience, that language knowledge, the cultural skills, the growing up and knowing the social structures and the social infrastructure that inform some of these barriers and some of the strengths and resiliencies of the communities that we're working in, and really funding and investing in that and making sure that we are creating job opportunities through community health worker programs and then development and advancement opportunities for folks that are community health workers, so that we can transform what the public health workforce looks like over time. So that, unfortunately, what we do know about pandemics is that these kinds of crises are inevitable, and we hope it's a good long time before we see another one again. But certainly there's a lot of threats and a lot of challenges out there, and having a workforce that better represents a public health workforce and a transportation environment, I think, that better represents the experiences and the identities of the people that are disproportionately impacted or who have less mobility options is really, really important to coming up with solutions that work for the population at large. So that's a quick summary of the work that we've been doing and how what we were doing before the pandemic and how the pandemic ended up throwing a wrench in things, but also ended up creating some really great partnership opportunities that we're really excited about. And that's the extent of what I was going to share today. And I guess I'll turn it back over, stop sharing, and turn it back over to Katie. So thank you so much for listening for a few.
Yep. And next up, we have Harrison and Renee at the end. So
Sure. Before I pull up my screen, I just wanted to highlight the background. I just decided to leave up the virtual background from a couple of weeks ago, showing a couple of our new publications. Since this is a book and music festival, why not try and talk our latest free publication on climate adaptation. So I'm going to flip through our website. I also decided I'm not going to show a PowerPoint. I usually have, 800 megabyte, 437 slide PowerPoints. So I'm going to just pull up our TOD website and click through a couple of highlights today. 1 second. Okay, that visible?
yep, it's looking good in your full screen.
Thank you so much. So this is our TOD website, and I really wanted to highlight this since it's got a tremendous amount of new information on there, and we reorganized it all over the last year since we weren't doing many public meetings during the last year and a half of COVID. Tim Streitz led our team to really revamp it. We tried to make it much more usable. So I'm just going to walk through these sliders on the front page that tell the TOD story. You'll notice our tagline is not live, work, play. It's live, work, connect, because that's, I think, our main job in TOD is connecting both all the work of the agencies, our partner organizations in the state, as well as connecting with the community and making sure that what we see on the ground provides more connectivity and better ways to get around. It's based on long-term growth plans. I think most people are familiar with the idea of keep the country country. That's like at least 2 generations of work, 40 or 50 years of saying we don't want to keep going up the hillsides and into the Central Plains. We want to refocus development in the urban area. And the rail project is a part of that growth policy. And it's not necessarily all about developing new land. The idea of plugging the pukas, looking for parking lots and small buildings that are little value, non-historic, some 30-year-old drive-in or something like that. And there's opportunity to redevelop those pukas to make it more livable, more walkable. It's also the idea of driving less and living more. Renee will talk more about the details of the streetscapes, but part of our job in the TOD world is to make sure that each private development makes the streetscape better. Sometimes if it's a major one, we can get them to add a bike lane or some intersection improvements. If it's new development on major sites, then we make sure that all those streetscapes interconnect with those around them to make it easier to get around, walking, biking. And I should also mention that it's not really a new idea. If you're familiar with Kaimuki and Top of the Hill, Waila Avenue, that was one of our original trolley car suburbs, generations ago. It was developed compactly, and it's a really walkable neighborhood up there because you could get to downtown and Chinatown on a trolley. Nowadays, our trolley is the bus. We have this award-winning bus system. A lot of TOD we think about, it's all about the rail, but there's a tremendous amount of work in writing into our plans and working with DTS and other agencies on making sure that the bus travel is improved, that walking and biking and rail access is improved. Well, there's a lot of information on our website about those projects as well. And making it easier to get around, integrating the bus, the rail, walking, biking, and making sure, rail is the backbone of that system. It will help folks get there faster. Well, folks have been recently saying, well, wait, if it's going to take years more for the rail to get downtown, is it still worth doing the TOD? Well, the quick answer is yes. All of the projects that are going in Ala Moana are near one of the award-winning bus system and great bus service to get downtown, to get into Waikiki. So rail will make it easier and quicker and faster and cheaper, but that doesn't mean we have to wait on the development until rail is operating. And I mentioned this at the beginning, the idea that developing more densely in the urban area means we don't keep eating pineapple fields for more subdivisions. And there's a tremendous amount of, I think there's in the easy to develop areas along the rail corridor, there's room for 55 to 60,000 units, which, you know, is roughly 20 to 30 years of demand here. This is tremendous capacity in those urban and suburban areas for a lot more development. And the policies, I'll point to a couple of those in a minute on the website, but those policies basically require that developers improve not only on their own site, but if they're a major development, they've got to make improvements nearby as well. And the ultimate goal is having, you know, really cool places like this for us to hang out. I think we saw over the last year and a half, not only here, but across the nation, how important it is to have safe, convenient places that people can gather, whether in the middle of COVID or it's just the peacetime wanting to have a healthier community. A lot of the principles that CJ talked about are baked into our work of healthy communities. But, you know, it's not just health, it's really making places that you want to be in that are fun, engaging. I think Renee will talk a little bit more about how we can make even street projects more interesting and fun. And I just want to highlight two other specific things on the website itself. Under planning initiatives, I'm going to click over to the wayfinding. We're getting ready to issue our wayfinding report soon, but this will just give you a feel for it. The idea that, you know, we need better information on how to get around, and, you know, how our young people go to high school. We're not only going to have signage eventually around at all the rail stations, and but eventually have an app that you can use to get around, and somebody like McConnell can, you know, meet up with his friends and use an app to figure out where to go and where to meet up. And then when you get off there, there's signs at the station entrance and a map on the train. And you get off and you're going to Pearl Ridge, you know, get off at the Colorado station. There'll be eventually signs to direct you up to the destination you're going to. And then, you know, we're going to make it easy for places like the malls and other buildings to also install signs that tell you how to get back to the rail station. So that's one of the cool things to watch out for. In the next month or two, that'll be up. The final report will be up online. And then I did just want to highlight one more thing. This book that I showed at the beginning, Climate Adaptation Design, Principles for Urban Development. The idea that in addition to thinking about maybe retreating from the shore in some cases, in some areas, it might make more sense just to elevate a little bit. So we came up with this guideline, just the principles for doing that, looking at resilient buildings and site design, and looking at some of the streetscape concepts and how you look at the resilient streetscape zone between the curb and the building and how you elevate that over time. So that's some of the cool stuff that's going on in TOD world. It's not all just about big development projects. We're looking at how to make each neighborhood better. I didn't mention this, but we've had, you know, pre-COVID, we've just had a, you know, decade of really hands-on public involvement with thousands of people and a lot of the, you know, organizations that Christopher mentioned in the health projects. So a lot of the work that we're presenting here is really ideas that came from our stakeholders. And I'm ready to pass it off to Renee. Let me stop sharing.
Thanks, Harrison and CJ and Katie. My name is Renee Espiau. Nice to be here with you all today to share the work that we do on Complete Streets. Let's see if I can try to hide my video here. So I oversee the Complete Streets program with the City and County of Honolulu. I was hired to basically try to make our city streets less like the cartoon that you see here and into something that we would imagine to be more in the heart of a livable city. So just going to share some highlights of our work today, and I'm excited to have our conversation with the team. So my program that I work on is called Complete Streets. For those of you who may be less familiar with the concept of complete streets, I like to show this sort of generic graphic from one of our national organizations that we look to for urban street guidance, NACDO. But this sort of shows, sort of a prototypical sort of ideal perfect street maybe. You've got, what we typically think of as street functions, right? You've got motor vehicle traffic and people kind of going to and from. You may have parking and loading on the sides, supporting the businesses and the residents that live there. But some of these elements we don't typically see on our urban streets. And so we have various efforts underway to try to figure out how to make our streets more complete, right? To include priority space for transit, for example, to provide dedicated space for people who want to get around by bicycle, either for transportation or for fun or for health. We often also forget about people who may have mobility challenges, right? People in wheelchairs or even just mothers with strollers. These people often have a very hard time navigating our streets on Oahu. And then of course, there's sort of the social life of a street, right? Businesses still out there. Katie mentioned kind of social interactions as being an element of livability, right? That's how typically we know our neighbors, right? Is because we see them on the street and that's where those interactions happen, and it's where that sort of social capital builds. And then the last element that you see here obviously is the trees, right? There's still an urban ecology that exists on our streets, even though they're often within a fully man-made and built environment. So this is kind of what we aspire to. And, in the title, I also tried to reframe how we think about our streets, right? Not just as thoroughfares for vehicles, or even people just moving and trying to get to what they need, but really streets as places for gathering, places for commerce, and places for interaction. And I think the challenge that we all struggle with is, how to create those kind of spaces to allow those fantastic benefits to accrue. Just a quick example, we do a lot of bicycle and pedestrian projects within my program. I'm sure you're all familiar with the South King Street Protected Bikeway that went in 2014. So very interesting to see how we're sort of piloting new strategies on how to make people feel more comfortable walking and biking in our urban areas. And of course, we've seen bike ridership explode on that facility. But we have also very excitingly seen pedestrian benefits as well. So this graphic actually shows pedestrian crashes before the bikeway went in on the left and then after on the right. And we've seen basically a 50% decrease in pedestrian crashes as a result of putting in bicycle infrastructure. So, interesting to think about how some of the strategies that we are piloting at the city appear to maybe just have one beneficiary, but seem to have actually broader benefits on creating a livable city, on creating safe ways for people to get around that does not require an automobile or carbon emissions. And so we continue to experiment and pilot new ways to move people safely. But then, of course, we also want to talk about how to make that place enjoyable and comfortable and a gathering space for residents too. And this responsibility is pretty, weighs on us a bit, right? Streets are nearly half of city-owned land. I think when most people think about public land and public space, they tend to think of parks or conservation areas, schools, community centers, those kinds of places. But streets actually comprise a huge portion of publicly owned land, of government-owned land. And so we have a kuleana to be responsible with those spaces, and then also think how they can be multifunction, right? Not just serving the movement of vehicles, but all these other great services that good streets can do. So just some of our other project examples, a few I wanted to highlight, not in your traditional realm of transportation and sort of getting people from point A to point B, but a little bit more about how streets can or cannot contribute to livability in terms of our natural environment. So the map on the left shows a urban heat map of Oahu. Not surprisingly, all the places that have more impervious surfaces and more pavement and more streets are hotter. So, one thing is, one strategy that we rely on heavily is trying to figure out how to plant more street trees. Not always a simple task, given that there are drainage structures and sewer lines and everything under the street, but that is a growing priority for the city. Another one that many people don't think of is that all of that real estate in streets, which cumulatively is worth about $50 billion, is also the place where a lot of our rainwater falls and gets channeled. So today, typically what happens is rainwater will fall on the street. It is channeled underground into the drainage system. And then it is diverted to probably a channelized stream. And then at the end point, it basically shoots straight out into the ocean, right? So you're sort of washing the street, washing all the oil and the brake dust and the tire dust and everything right off the street and straight onto our reefs, right? So no surprise that we have some nearshore water pollution problems on Oahu. So how can we use our streets and use all that space to improve our water quality, right? So this is an example of some permeable pavers that we recently installed in Chinatown and our pedestrian curb extensions, where water can actually trickle down into the ground and recharge without carrying pollutants straight into our waterways. And then the example on the right here shows a installation underneath the sidewalk at the Waipahu Transit Center. And this whole structure is basically just to provide for healthy, happy tree roots, which often the reason you see why street trees die is because they're trying to live in a very hostile environment with not enough space to grow and thrive. So we're really trying to rethink how we use our streets, both for getting around, but also just being good stewards of that. And then the last thing I wanted to share was that we're not, all these improvements are not top down. They're not coming just from the city. We're sort of very busy trying to figure out how to fill our gap in infrastructure, build missing sidewalks and everything. But we have some really exciting examples of community-led projects that are popping up in communities as well. So the example on the left it was a great project out in Ewa Beach where tons of different community members came together to do this huge street mural along a route where kids walk to school every morning to give them more space and encourage cars to turn slower through the intersection. And then parklets, I'm sure you guys have seen these either in Kaka'ako or Kaimuki. We have a program where we work with businesses who are interested in installing these in parking spaces. And we work with them to do design review and go through the permitting process and everything. And we've seen an increasing demand and interest in these spaces since COVID. So very interesting to see how some of our work also evolves with newer happenings. So this is our website, honolulu.gov/complete streets. We have lots of projects across the island where we're doing sort of various combinations of these elements, and we encourage you guys to learn more and get involved in your own neighborhood. So that's it. Thanks.
Great. Now let's dive right into conversation. I think the first thing I want to do is to everybody who's attending and a participant is that we have zero questions from the audience, and no question is too big, too small, too goofy, especially if I recognize your name. I will tell you, I would love to be able to answer, pull some questions from the audience. So if at all possible. That being said, I did come prepared. And so I think one of the first things I sort of want to talk about, because I think it shows up in literally every conversation. I work in a bunch of different topics. Is about the cost of living here. And what I kind of wanted folks to talk about a little bit is some of the relationships between your work, because every single one of you are doing things that addresses that. And sometimes it's not always obvious. And I think it's important. So I think what we'll do is we'll start with Harrison, because I think his is a good first start. And then we'll see where that goes. Because I think if we don't talk about the issues that everybody else talks about, then sometimes people don't always realize how relevant the work that we're doing is to some of those topics.
Sure, just generic question about how we address costs in in TOD?
Yeah, or just the rising cost of living that people are worried about when housing costs are so, higher and gas continues to go up. And, we're starting to see some concerns about the supply chains and the cost of the products here. And like, I think most people have some story of like how I had to wait X, Y, and Z for something, or the costs of schools, and how in terms of like just all the preparations to get kids back to schools, and those just kind of a lot of those big issues. I just want to try and help make some of those connections.
Well, to boil it down to maybe two simple concepts, it's no coincidence that the two major items in most household budget, the cost of your housing, whether you're buying or renting, and the cost of transportation, whether you're driving or on the bus, are two of the biggest household items. Those are also the two sectors that are really the biggest, GHG emitters if you're concerned about climate. And so things that we can do to reduce the cost of your housing, as well as reduce the cost of your commute, will also help us with addressing climate and GHG emissions. So TOD, I was just on a national webinar of the Revolution this morning, and a guy from Brookings was presenting some of the latest research. And at a national level, international, they're basically saying we're doing a lot better on a lot of the climate mitigation strategies, but housing and transport are still way up there and rising. So by building more compactly, slightly smaller units in TOD area so that it's more walkable, your energy costs are a little bit lower. Our TOD policies generally for major development require a certain percentage of the units to be affordable. And both, city and state are working to use some of the public lands to develop a lot more affordable housing. So that's one side of it, making more affordable stuff. But the transportation side, the things that both CJ and Renee talked about, ways to make it so that if you, forget the two-car family, we have some families that live and they've got, 3 or 4 generations, and there's 4 or 5 cars between the different generations in one house. And so if we can improve the transit service, make communities more walkable, the roads safer, we'll give those folks the option of having, be able to reduce the number of cars. In some cases, have one car that the family shares, or even no car. And we're seeing some development proposed that actually has no parking, and no plans to have cars in the development. So I think those are the ways to attack the costs in terms of our policies and our investments. On a personal level, we're always just so happy when our young people move back home and are able to make a living here. I'm glad to say that my son and his wife and 2 young kids, a 2002 Roosevelt grad, just moved back home, and we're sharing my car. So 3 of us drivers sharing one car that we all rarely use anyway. So.
Okay, I'm Renee, I know you have some answers for this as well, but I actually want to kind of pop it to CJ a bit, because I don't know how the answer plays out when you're coming from more of the health perspective. And I'm sort of curious if you have a different take on it. And if the answer is no, or that's
no,
okay.
I think that there's a couple of things, right? I think we see as people are displaced from job centers and are living in places where there's longer commutes or larger families living together, we see that has impacts on health outcomes specifically. And again, this goes back to this connection of social determinants to both our chronic disease incidents and then also to COVID and how those things kind of interact with one another, right? So what we worry about is making sure that solutions are, I think, accessible to all communities, and that when we look at things, when we look at some of these strategies for transportation demand management or transit-oriented development, making sure that they're not commodified in such a way that they're inaccessible to certain parts of the population that can't benefit from them. And I know we're all thinking about that. But it is a really challenging thing. It's as long as we have sort of a capitalist system for how we sell land or how we manage real estate, there's always going to be some monetization of amenities. And right now those amenities are walkability, and those things are living close to where you work. And so as land gets more expensive, and as it gets more expensive to live here, then we see people getting displaced from places that they've lived and getting, forced further and further away from jobs and into larger and larger households, and further away from healthcare. and further away from healthy food, and further away from recreation, and they spend more time commuting and less time, they're less likely to commute actively or have access to active transportation options. So there's a huge impact, I think, and that's just like kind of scratching the surface. But yeah, definitely, I think cost of living is, and of course, somebody mentioned in the chat homelessness, and obviously homelessness is a byproduct of a lot of these, a confluence of different, structural forces and pressures. And when we're not addressing those, I mean, housing is healthcare. We know that really convincingly is much harder to maintain population health when you have a population that is being excluded from the market for whatever reasons, or excluded from preventative health care. It is really, really hard to manage chronic disease and to manage to get people to and from work without housing as kind of a base level amenity. So yeah, these things are all connected, and healthcare, transportation are one and the same, essentially.
Yeah. Renee, anything to chime in?
No, I mean, I'm sort of looking at the questions typed in, so you let me know which ones you want to discuss or which ones I should.
Sure, I actually think bringing
up
up the
personal opinions on.
I know, I'll bring up the homelessness one because I do think it's a really valid point, and we would be remiss because it is related to the cost of living. Like, we do know part of that, which is, there's a growing number of homeless people on our sidewalks, parks, and bus stops, the tents, and a lot of our visualizations sort of reflect this idealized version of Honolulu, which is probably, maybe not as realistic as we'd hope. I think one of the things to sort of I think that all of us are sort of subject to, so I'm going to answer a little bit of this question, right, is that the visualizations are meant to show like what we can work towards compared to what we have. But I know from our work, a lot of times people just don't even know what it looks like to have more transportation options, to have different types of housing. And so I do want to say that some of those visualizations are meant to help people get there, because they haven't experienced it. They know what they know. And we, in order to change some of these patterns and to meet these bigger commitments and these desires from the community and these unmet needs, we do have to kind of illustrate it sometimes. So, but I do want to come back to the housing. I just wanted to answer the visualization one because I've been struggling with it myself a bit. I think CJ, you answered it really well. But around like that, housing is healthcare, and this is a common problem across the United States, really. And that like it's exploded in most major American cities, and a lot of it does have to do with the cost of housing. And I think it's important to sort of talk about how people are trying to address that. Both in housing the way Harrison is, you said 60,000 units, like those types of supply do start to help change the dynamics, although maybe not enough. Do you guys want to chime in on the homelessness issue a little bit more? Anybody have other points?
I guess I would say in brief, I think that the framing of it is the homeless are a problem, rather than that there's a system that makes it harder and harder for people to find housing and to find healthcare and to find work, and have an alignment between income that's available and supportive housing that they can afford, and having our healthcare tied to our work a lot of times, and having it be unstable for that reason, and having a lot of people's access to healthcare being really vulnerable and really fragile. Those are, to me, root causes, not the homeless. I think the idea of focusing on the aesthetics or their stench or making them the problem I find kind of offensive. So I would reframe the question as what failures have happened structurally, what can we do structurally to better meet more of our population's need, so that people aren't in homelessness. I mean, we all suffer from it, obviously, but I wouldn't pretend. I live in Chinatown. We have a lot of homeless neighbors, and they're good people, they're good neighbors. They need more support and more resources. And that I think that's really important to push back on a little bit.
Can I chime in? So yeah. I do street projects. So we have a lot of interaction with homeless because that's where a lot of them live. It is an incredibly challenging problem that the city and state put their head in the sand about for decades. And only in the last 10 years or so has the city at least said, you know what? This is our problem, and we need to reestablish a housing department. We need to put a lot of money into this problem. So that said, it's a huge problem. It's a very challenging problem to solve, but I don't work on that problem, right? If everyone at the city worked on one problem, then we would have lots of other problems. And so like my big challenge is we kill 20-something people a year trying to cross the street, right? And most of those people are kupuna, and they are probably going to or from a bus stop, and they, I don't know, aren't visible, they walk too slow, whatever it is. So that's my particular challenge that I am trying to solve within the city. So I have great appreciation for the people who work on the homeless problems because they see it firsthand. But we have so many other challenges as well concurrently, right? And so I don't think any of us mean to downplay the importance of that challenge, but we have so many other challenges too.
I will also note that I think in the last week or two, the mayor did announce sort of a more different police style response. So when 911 was called, that they're now launching up a non-police response that includes social workers and outreach. And I would say, broadly speaking, within the homeless discussion nationwide, that is one of the best practices. I think the fact that we are engaging in that and trying to change some of the dynamics of the interactions and build out the housing. I think there are a lot of things broadly speaking. So I'm going to move on to the next question. We have one about like, what are some of the avenues for funding these projects that you are pursuing to bring these projects to life? There's not enough of them, but that's not enough. We need more people too, right, Renee? A big part of the challenge is how to get the projects in the ground too. So go.
So everybody always comes with the panacea of go get federal funding, right? To build sidewalks and bike lanes and all this stuff. Federal funding is super hard to use. Federal funding is why HART was vulnerable to lawsuits, right? Because there's like federal rules that you have to comply with, and it's just very onerous. So we tend to use general fund or highway tax revenue for a lot of our projects, unless they're big enough to go after the federal money. Then it makes sense. There's like an economy of scale there to go after federal funding for some of the bigger stuff, like the Alawai Bridge, the new pedestrian bridge, for example, or Salt Lake Boulevard widening. But generally, for us to be kind of lean and as quick and scrappy as we can be, we're generally looking for local funds. Thanks to Harrison, we actually have a fair amount of private contributions now too, coming in from some new development in Ala Moana. I've got almost $1 million in commitments from developments there just for bike lanes on Ke'amoku and similar improvements. So that's exciting too, that some of these new developments see the benefit of being in a walkable, bikeable neighborhood, and they're actually directly contributing to it.
So similarly, I think one of
Katie,
the
I would just add that one of the, you can't, if you got a limited amount of butter, you can't spread it on all the bread evenly. So, you use it on the bites that you're eating and try and coordinate the timing of the butter to when you're going to eat that particular piece of bread. And I think similarly, if the city in particular, our capital dollars are limited, but there's still a lot that we're spending. And so part of the job is to really coordinate. We're spending a lot on sewer improvements and water improvements every year and street improvements. And part of the job is coordinating those in places where it makes sense and where we're having, we see upcoming, projects being built as well. And that'll kind of coordinate and connect the dots of those private investments that Renee is talking about. I should mention, give some credit to the state TOD Council. The state agencies own roughly 2,000 acres of land around the rail stations. And so there's a really all hands on deck of about 8 or 10 state agencies working to plan and work with the city on the TOD plans and target infrastructure around those state lands. And there'll be a lot more affordable housing as well built on some of those state properties. So it's a little bit of a longer game to get through with the RFPs to put all that public land out for RFP for public-private development. But that's in process and really moving pretty well. So, and however much money you have, the coordination is at least as important as getting more money.
I think that gets to that question about Singapore model too, right? Isn't that what Singapore, they use public land for affordable housing?
Yeah. Somebody mentioned, asking whether there's an intention to, follow the Singapore model. And, there are folks in the state legislature that have actually been studying Singapore and making that pitch here. Whether it's direct copy of Singapore, which is different land use model and different regulations, or just the idea of using the public lands, state and city, and making sure that there's a lot of affordable housing there, and that some of it is for sale and not just for rent. It's a little harder to sell the units on private land, but both state and city are discussing that option. So I think it's likely to happen.
Great. So we also have a really broad question that I think is really interesting because I'm not even sure I have a great answer right off the top, but what's the number one priority the city or state should pursue to efficiently and equitably support livable cities? If you could pick one, that's a tough question. I know, look at CJ's face. He's like,
I have one.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead,
out there. So just to frame my daily challenge, we have I work within city right away, right? So within the street right away, it's extremely fixed, right? In most of Oahu, unless it's like a new area like a Ho'opili or Koa Ridge, and I don't really work there. There's only so much space, and we are always trying to make difficult trade-offs between different uses of that limited land, very valuable land. What we've been doing for a very long time is prioritizing single occupant vehicles, right? Get cars to move as quickly as possible. But we all know, well, maybe don't all know, but professionals all know that that's like the least efficient way to move people. And so we're trying to rethink how we allocate street space. Yes, we need vehicle lanes for people who just need to drive around, zip around, drop off the kids, whatever. But we've traditionally have not rewarded the people that made the more responsible choice, right? So some of you may be familiar with the bus lane that we put in Honolulu, downtown Honolulu last year, where we said, you know what, this is space that's going to be for people who make the responsible choice to ride transit, and we're going to reward them for like the first time ever, instead of just making them sit in a bus and crawl along with everybody else in traffic. And then you can see it in the way we're trying to design our bikeways now, right? With protection so people feel safe, and that takes more space. So that's, I think, what we're, our number one kind of mission is to move more people safely in a very limited amount of space. And we've got some new tools for that. And we're trying to reward people for making the responsible decisions.
I would agree. Much as I want to see more development and more housing built, and those are really, long-term plays. I agree that Renee's kind of focus on reprioritizing and fitting more users and balancing kind of the equity across the users of space is probably the biggest bang for the buck in terms of making it more livable, and safer to get around. So I guess the real request would be, for everybody who uses streets, in particular the drivers, to just have a little bit more aloha about realizing they're not the only users. There's a lot of people on those buses, that are stuck. There's a lot of Kapuna and kids trying to cross the street. And, we've seen the success of the bike lanes and some of the other uses of the street. So let's just be a little nicer to each other in figuring out how to reallocate that. It doesn't always, if you're a driver, actually really impact you that much, but let's just rebalance with aloha.
I really like the Jane Jacobs quote: cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they're created by everybody. And I think that's where we're focused. I think all these things are really valuable and really important, but what we would like to do, the role that we would like to play is to try to support that full participation, and whether that participation is civic or economic or social. I think the goal and the way that we can make healthier cities and more sustainable cities is try to foster decision making that's more participatory and it's more reflective of the values and the needs and the lived experiences of everybody that inhabits them. And it's a huge challenge. It's not an easy quick fix, but I think really being intentional about not simply transactionally engaging with populations, but rather building these relationships by investing in developing, as I mentioned earlier, lived experience as expertise. We have been reminded like we never have before, that that there is no substitute for that, for really, really investing in lived experience as part of the decision-making process. You know, you can be, we have this transportation equity working group, and the first couple of times that it met, people would constantly say, oh, I'm really interested in this, but I'm not an expert. And we had to remind people, no, you are experts. You are the experts on how do you get around, on how you get to work, on how you get to school, on where it's scary for you to get to work and scary for you to get to school, why you miss, neonatal appointments, why your kapuna don't feel safe walking around after dark. So I think that the communities are experts, and the more we value and the more we enrich that expertise and honor that expertise and integrate that expertise into our decision-making processes, the healthier and more resilient and more sustainable we'll be. And it's a tough lift, but I think that's what we would like to do, like how we see this resolving.
So I'm gonna take it a little bit more of maybe a bureaucratic step further, if you will. It was just funny because I'm not the one inside the bureaucracies per se. I'm on the outside. But I think sort of also, CJ, like telling the story of that. I think as someone who does sort of, try and understand what's happening a bit more on the outside, obviously we work with a lot of folks, but sometimes it's hard to know, like, what are agencies and what are different programs trying to do and under what circumstances, and how are they evaluating it? Like, a lot of what we see is that nobody ever went back to find out if something worked, to the earlier, thing about King Street, showing those things. And I want to both like commend everybody on this call who does that, because I think y'all do, but I also know that there's like a huge swath of both agencies and to a certain degree like nonprofits who and non-governmental organizations, probably ourselves, mine own included, that we don't always show how we're doing that as well. And I think that's an important element of like a dynamic feedback loop for all of our organizations and for all of our community members. I mean, maybe not everybody on the ground who lives in the community has to do it, but I think like looking for it, understanding it, seeing it, it kind of takes the on the ground about how we reward people, coupled with CJ's point about like the process and inclusivity, that I think kind of also, ensuring that we let people know about it in some of the most basic ways, because we don't even do that sometimes. We are coming up on the last 4 minutes of our time, I believe, unless I got the end time wrong, but I think I'm right. And I think what I would love to know is like, what are you really excited about? Like having come online, the next step that you're taking, what's that bright spot that you were like, yeah, there's all this stuff that sucks, that's true, but I can't do anything about it. But what's the stuff that like we're trying to take to the next level and the bright spot ahead?
I was really worried when I started to approach COVID partners about active living and active transportation, that they were going to be like, we got bigger things to worry about than bikes. We're worried about survival. But almost all of them, everybody we approached and said, would you guys like to be involved in this kind of work? Everybody said, yeah, this is really important to us. This is really valuable in our communities, and creating more active and more walkable and more bikeable spaces was part of their priorities. And so that's what I'm really excited about, is that all these partnerships that have been really, really hard fought over the last year and a half are going to survive and going to thrive, and we're going to develop them into longer term public health and public health change agencies and partnerships. So I'm excited about that.
I'm excited to watch it and, be a supporter of it. Go ahead, Harrison.
Yeah, I would, I think I'm both excited and scared as heck about all the things related to climate. It's exciting because planners love challenges, and I've been working on climate stuff for almost 3 decades now, but it's really time to act. And I think the city is doing a tremendous amount about it, but we need to do a lot more and a lot more faster. And so that both excites me and scares me at the same time. I do want to also, in terms of the things that are really kind of exciting, the opportunity for really seeing some of this change happen on public lands, not only on Oahu, but somebody else mentioned what's happening on the neighbor islands, and one of the questions above there. And I should point out that state TOD council includes the other 3 counties as well. And yes, they are doing a lot of really cool work that in some cases is cooler and better than what we're doing on Oahu. So I'd really look at some of those ideas. You can get to the state TOD council website. If you go to honolulu.gov/TOD, you'll see the website I showed. Go down to the very bottom of that page, and there's a link to the state TOD council. And you can see what the neighbor islands are doing there. Renee?
I think this is a really exciting time to personally to work for the city and county of Honolulu. We have many challenges, and I'm not going to pretend like we don't. We've got 900 miles of missing sidewalks, and I mean, all kinds of really insurmountable issues that we got to start chipping away at. But the willingness is there, and the public is asking for it, and our elected officials are asking for it, and we're trying to find a way to do things differently. And I really encouraged by the sense of experimentation and piloting within our streets. I mean, we're trying things for stormwater quality. We're just like throwing stuff out in crosswalks to see if, it helps drivers stop and actually yield to pedestrians. We're trying all kinds of different bikeway designs, and there's just a general sense within the staff of like, we have a lot to learn and we have a lot to try, and we're not afraid to try it. And so that's really exciting, and I hope reassuring to you guys that the bureaucracy in the government, at least at the city and county level, it is changing. I'm sure it's always changing, but I really think it's moving in a positive direction right now.
I actually think that's a great note to end on, although I could contribute. I think we hit the 5 o'clock mark perfectly. So yeah, I guess thank you, everybody. I know we did not hit every question. I think there's one on TOD for you, Harrison, maybe if you got to it. But thank you, everybody, so much for joining us today. I had a wonderful time. It's always great to talk to people who are excited and passionate about the work and the direction that our community is taking to make it more livable, more sustainable, more inclusive. Everything CJ said in the Jane Jacobs quote, I'm sure we could pull a lot more from her as well. So thank you so much. Roger, is there anything you would like to say as the, the big poobah of this entire festival?
Microphone. Roger, you're not live.
Well, I am alive, not live. Thank you very much, panel, and particularly to Katie for actually thinking of it and organizing it. It was a terrific idea, and one that will follow up next year, I'm quite sure. And thank you, panel. It was a really valuable and thoroughly interesting panel, and I just like the spirit of it. Attendees, if you want to see it again, or if you want your Ohana and your colleagues and network to see it, it will be available pretty much right away on the Better Tomorrow Speaker Series YouTube site. And then down the road a couple of weeks, we will edit it into highlights, and that will be up on our website for at least a year. So everyone can enjoy it at any time or refresh their memory of it. Again, thank you so much, Katie and panelists. Aloha.
Thanks, Katie. Thank you, everybody.